Our story begins in the twilight years of the Edwardian Age's influence, a time when aristocratic glamour still held sway over British society, and scandal lurked in every drawing room. Born Ethel Margaret Whigham on December 1st, 1912, she was the only child of George Whigham, a self-made Scottish millionaire whose fortune came from the world of finance and textiles, and his socially ambitious American wife, Helen. From the very start, Margaret was raised to shine. The Whighams led a cosmopolitan life, shuttling between luxurious homes in New York, London, and their estate in Scotland. In Manhattan, young Margaret was educated at the prestigious Hewitt School, where her dazzling beauty and innate charisma set her apart from her classmates. A peerless complexion, striking blue-green eyes, and a waterfall of honey-blonde hair made her an object of fascination from an early age. Even as a child, she understood the currency of beauty and the intoxicating power it held over others. By her teenage years, Margaret was already making an impression among society's elite. She attended glittering soirees and charity balls with her mother, dressed in the latest Parisian fashions and adorned with her mother's diamond heirlooms. The press soon took notice. In 1930, at the tender age of 17, she was presented at the court of King George V, a ritual that marked a young woman's official entry into high society. But for Margaret, it was not merely a rite of passage, it was a coronation. That same year, she was named Debutante of the Year, a title that came with instant celebrity. In the gossipy world of interwar Britain, few names inspired such breathless intrigue. The British press swooned, declaring, "Photographs of her have appeared so often, they are as well known as any film star." Margaret was, in effect, one of Britain's very first it girls, long before the term was coined. She was the face of a new generation of fashionable, modern young women who broke with the stiff conventions of their Edwardian mothers. She moved effortlessly in aristocratic circles, her phone book littered with the names of dukes, playboys, racing magnates, and exiled princes. By the age of 19, Margaret had already been engaged no fewer than 4 times. Among her suitors were Prince Ali Khan, the dashing and scandal-prone son of the Aga Khan, the heir to a Scottish dukedom, a titled guards officer, and Max Aitken, son of Press Baron Lord Beaverbrook, one of the most powerful media magnates of his day. Yet Margaret's glittering exterior masked a more complicated private life. In an era when upper-class women were expected to remain virginal until marriage, she defied the rules with the same verve she brought to a Charleston at the Café de Paris. At just 15, Margaret embarked on a whirlwind romance with a young, aspiring actor by the name of David Niven, who would later become one of Britain's most beloved screen stars. The affair resulted in a secret pregnancy and, at her mother's insistence, a discreet abortion performed under a pseudonym. In her later years, Margaret would confide the episode to close friends, a moment of vulnerability amid a lifetime of public bravado. Though adored for her beauty and charm, not everyone was enchanted. Friends often described her as a heady combination of enchantment and calculation. One society hostess observed that she could be supremely charming and maddeningly ruthless in the same evening. A lifelong friend called her the debutante of the season, who floated through society like a princess but landed where she pleased. Even from a young age, Margaret was aware of the double standards that governed her world. The indiscretions of men and their affairs, debts, and dalliances were dismissed with a wink and a shrug. But for women, a single misstep could mean social exile. Margaret, however, refused to play by those rules. One biographer would later write, pointedly, that the problem with the Duchess of Argyll, as she would later become, was that she enjoyed the same lust for life as any man, and refused to apologize for it. Her appetite for pleasure was legendary. She adored fine champagne, Cartier jewels, couture gowns from Mamboche and Schiaparelli, and the thrill of attention. She once remarked that beauty is a duty and glamour a weapon, and she wielded both to dazzling effect. In the smoke-filled clubs of Mayfair and on the sun-drenched terraces of the Riviera, Margaret became a byword for decadent allure. But beneath the pearls and bright young things' laughter, the seeds of future scandal were already sown. Margaret Whigham was not content to be a society ornament. She intended to leave her mark on history, whatever the cost. And history would, in time, remember her well, though not always kindly. This, then, was the beginning of Margaret Whigham's extraordinary story, a girl born to wealth and privilege who refused to be tamed by the strictures of her class and time, and whose hunger for life, love, and luxury would one day bring the very foundations of the British aristocracy to its knees. As the 1930s unfurled like a grand silk curtain, Margaret Whigham stood at the very epicentre of London's fashionable society. She was wealthy, beautiful, and endlessly photographed. The press dubbed her the girl with the perfect face, while society pages breathlessly chronicled her every move, from afternoons at Claridge's to late-night revelries at the Embassy Club. It was inevitable that a woman of such beauty and social rank would attract suitors, and though she danced with princes, flirted with heirs, and dined with magnates, it was a certain Charles Sweeney, a wealthy American golfer and stockbroker, who finally captured her hand, if not entirely her heart. Charles Sweeney was no ordinary suitor. Handsome, charismatic, and fabulously rich, he cut a fine figure in London society. But unlike the European aristocrats who fawned over Margaret, Sweeney brought with him a brash, modern American confidence that intrigued her. He was worldly, adventurous, and unafraid of her formidable mother, Helen Whigham, whose approval was a prerequisite for any marriage. By the winter of 1933, the fairy tale seemed complete. Margaret Whigham, the dazzling it-girl of London society, was about to marry one of the era's most eligible bachelors. Charles Francis Sweeney, a handsome, wealthy American socialite, amateur golfer, and the embodiment of transatlantic glamour. The wedding promised to be nothing short of a spectacle. On 21st February 1933, the streets of Knightsbridge came to a standstill. Crowds numbering in the thousands gathered outside the Brompton Oratory, eager for a glimpse of the radiant bride. Police struggled to contain the surging masses as photographers jostled for position. London has seldom seen such a congregation of wealth, beauty, and scandal, one society columnist would later remark. And then she appeared. Margaret's wedding gown, designed by the young and then rising Norman Hartnell, was an astonishing creation of creamy ivory, silk satin, and tulle, adorned with hand-sewn glass beads that caught the light like diamonds. The gown's most breathtaking feature was its 2.6-metre train, which swept regally behind her as she made her way into the oratory. It was a triumph of modern couture, and decades later the gown would take its rightful place in the Victoria and Albert Museum's permanent collection, a testament to the enduring allure of Britain's scandalous Duchess. The ceremony itself was lavish and meticulously orchestrated. Among the guests were dukes, duchesses, titled aristocrats, and Hollywood stars. The air inside the oratory shimmered with the scent of lilies and jasmine, and the altar gleamed with candles and gold. Even the famously caustic Cole Porter took note. He cheekily updated the lyrics of his hit song, "You're the Top," slipping in a line praising Mrs. Sweeney as society's reigning queen. It was a mark of Margaret's stature. She wasn't merely a socialite, she was a cultural phenomenon. For over a decade, Margaret lived what appeared to be the charmed life of a society wife. She resided in an opulent flat on Park Lane, attended the most exclusive balls, and became a fixture at Royal Ascot and Goodwood. She was rarely seen without a couture creation by Hartnell, Victor Steeble, or Elsa Schiaparelli, her wardrobe an ever-changing display of elegance and extravagance. Margaret was like a peacock in a world of sparrows, one acquaintance later recalled. Society magazine Tatler dubbed her London's loveliest hostess, and photographs of her appeared so frequently that one newspaper quipped, "Margaret Sweeney is more photographed than any royal except the Queen herself." Her home became a salon for diplomats, aristocrats, artists, and exiled royals. Even the notoriously standoffish Wallis Simpson warmed to Margaret's sparkling wit. The Duchess of Windsor once described her as wickedly entertaining, a reputation Margaret enjoyed cultivating. But behind the scenes, tragedy stalked the Sweeney marriage. In late 1933, Margaret gave birth to a stillborn daughter after 8 agonizing months of pregnancy. The loss devastated her. She would later confide to a friend, "I thought my heart would break." In the years that followed, she suffered a further 8 miscarriages, an ordeal she endured largely in private. Society's demands meant appearances had to be maintained, grief discreetly hidden beneath layers of Schiaparelli silk and Cartier diamonds. Despite these heartbreaks, Margaret and Charles managed to have 2 children, Frances Helen, born in 1937, and Brian Charles, in 1940. Friends noted, however, that their marriage was increasingly marred by tension. Charles Sweeney was a philanderer by reputation, frequently seen in the company of showgirls and actresses. Margaret, though loyal in public, refused to play the role of the wronged wife indefinitely. "I never believed fidelity was a virtue expected of only one partner," she would later remark dryly in her memoirs. Society friends such as Lady Ursula Darboux observed that Margaret maintained her own flirtations, always careful, always discreet. She had suitors, of course she did. Who wouldn't with that face and fortune, Lady Ursula recalled. In the 1930s and early 40s, Margaret transformed herself into one of London's most celebrated hostesses. Her dinners at Park Lane and later Upper Grosvenor Street were legendary. Affairs of crystal chandeliers, orchestras hidden behind palms, and guest lists studded with dukes, earls, and visiting princes. Even Prince Ali Khan, once a teenage suitor, remained in her orbit, occasionally seated beside her at dinners, prompting knowing glances from other guests. There were whispered rumours of flirtations with prominent politicians and a certain well-known actor, though nothing ever proven. Noel Coward adored her. "Margaret was a jewel," he wrote in a private letter. "Dazzling, irreverent, scandalous, a born scene-stealer." By 1947, after 14 years of marriage, the relationship had frayed beyond repair. Charles Sweeney's affairs had become too public, and Margaret's increasingly independent spirit chafed against the expectations of her role. Yet their divorce was surprisingly amicable, especially by the brutal standards of later years. Margaret left the marriage wealthy, socially powerful, and unbowed. A Town and Country profile later noted, "The Sweeneys parted with surprising decorum. It was understood that each had loved the other in their own way, but neither could abide the constraints of a conventional marriage." By now, Margaret had transformed herself into one of London's most famous and wealthy socialites in her own right, no longer merely a society wife, but a force unto herself. As one contemporary observed, "It was a new world after the war. The men came back damaged, but the women had changed too." And Margaret was the perfect embodiment of that restless, glittering, unapologetic new order. After her divorce in 1947, Margaret Whigham did not retreat into the shadows, as many might have expected. Quite the opposite. London's glittering post-war society was undergoing a transformation, and Margaret was at its very centre, a survivor of a vanished pre-war world and a symbol of the resilience and irrepressible glamour of the old aristocratic order. In the late 1940s, she resumed her rightful place at the pinnacle of London's social scene. She was photographed at horse races, charity galas, and embassy receptions, often seen in the company of Europe's remaining royalty and a new breed of transatlantic socialites and film stars. It was said that no society column was complete without a mention of Miss Margaret Whigham, impeccably dressed in Dior or Hartnell, her pearls perfectly matched, her lipstick always flawless. The News Chronicle marvelled, "Miss Margaret Whigham goes everywhere, and photographs of her have appeared so often they are as well known as any film star." Though her marriage to Charles Sweeney had ended, Margaret's allure remained undiminished. She was courted by aristocrats, millionaires, and minor European royals. Among those rumoured to pursue her attentions were Prince Ali Khan, the dashing playboy son of the Aga Khan, George Babe, Plunket Earl Drax, a wealthy baronet, and even a discreet liaison with an unnamed member of the House of Windsor, though Margaret would never confirm such whispers. It was in 1949, during a journey aboard a train from Paris to London, that fate dealt her what would prove to be a devastating card. Sitting alone in a carriage was Ian Douglas Campbell, the 11th Duke of Argyll. A tall, broad-shouldered Scotsman with piercing blue eyes and the cool detachment of an old-world aristocrat, Campbell was the chief of Clan Campbell and heir to the sprawling Inverary Castle in the Scottish Highlands. Margaret, accustomed to attention and flirtation, was immediately intrigued. The Duke exuded an air of authority and melancholy, the kind of brooding charisma women like Margaret found irresistible. She would later admit, "I should have known better, but how wonderfully romantic it all seemed at the time." They quickly struck up a flirtation, and within months their affair was the subject of knowing glances at London dinner parties. Margaret, always a woman of intense, if often ill-fated passions, became utterly captivated. She saw Ian as a way to restore herself to the ranks of Britain's great titled women, and he saw in Margaret something even more valuable: money. What Margaret could not yet fully know was that Ian Campbell was a man carrying deep, unhealed wounds. During the Second World War, he had served in the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders and was captured by the Germans, spending years as a prisoner of war. Those years left him psychologically scarred, and his return to civilian life had been marked by increasing paranoia, erratic moods, and violent rages. Ian had already left a trail of damaged lives behind him. His first wife, Janet Gladys Aitken, daughter of newspaper magnate Lord Beaverbrook, had accused him of cruelty and alcoholism. His second wife, Louise Clews, an American heiress, fared little better, alleging domestic violence and financial manipulation. He was notorious for his addictions to alcohol, gambling, and prescription drugs, particularly painkillers. His violent temper was legendary in aristocratic circles. His stepson-in-law, the celebrated writer Norman Mailer, later described him as one of the coldest, nastiest men I've ever known. His primary obsession was Inverary Castle, a Gothic revival estate on the banks of Loch Fyne, which had been the ancestral seat of the Campbells since the 18th century. But maintaining the castle was an expensive affair. Its upkeep had bankrupted previous duchesses, and Ian had become increasingly ruthless in exploiting the wealth of his wives to fund his personal ambitions. Despite this ominous history, on 23 March 1951, Margaret Whigham became Margaret Campbell, Duchess of Argyll. The society pages rejoiced in the union of a glamorous heiress and a Scottish duke. The Duchess, as she was now reverently titled by the press, brought not only her renowned beauty and formidable social connections to Inverary, but also a considerable fortune, which Ian eagerly absorbed into the upkeep of his crumbling estate. Margaret, in turn, was enchanted by the romance of it all. She threw herself into her new role with characteristic flair, revitalising Inverary Castle with elegant parties, charity events, and shooting weekends attended by the cream of British aristocracy and international society. Her love of couture remained undiminished. She brought Hartnell, Balenciaga, and Dior into the Highlands, scandalising local gentry with her parade of silk evening gowns and fur-trimmed coats. Town and country would later remark, Even though the Duchess of Argyll's adultery and sex life would later get the glaring spotlight, her husband was hardly innocent. But beneath the veneer of grandeur and good taste, storm clouds gathered. Margaret quickly discovered the depth of Ian's cruelty and addictions. He drank to excess, was unfaithful almost from the outset, and gambled away vast sums. His temper, once merely sharp, became dangerous. Servants at Inverary whispered about his violent rages, and previous duchesses wrote privately to Margaret, warning her of what lay ahead. The marriage rapidly descended into a cycle of recrimination and suspicion. Ian accused Margaret of infidelity, not entirely without cause, as Margaret continued to attract admirers wherever she went. Yet it was Ian's obsession with control and wealth that truly poisoned their union. He began siphoning off her money to fund his estates and personal vices. Margaret's generous dowry and personal fortune were ruthlessly drained. Whenever she protested, he threatened her reputation and position. Yet, Margaret was not easily cowed. As she had done all her life, she refused to be a victim. "I've dealt with rogues before," she told a confidant. "One must play the long game." The marriage of Margaret Whigham and Ian Campbell, 11th Duke of Argyll, had always been a precarious union. A dazzling facade, hiding fault lines that widened with each passing year. From the very beginning, it was a contest of wills, not a partnership, but a duel. Both were determined characters. Margaret, the indomitable socialite, used to commanding attention and loyalty, and Ian, a cold, calculating aristocrat, driven by money and status, and consumed by the ghosts of his past. Their war was one of secrets, power, and survival. Margaret at first poured herself into life at Inverary Castle. The romantic ideal of reviving a decaying ancestral home, coupled with her genuine affection for Scotland's sweeping landscapes and ancient traditions, appealed to her theatrical sense of drama. She organised lavish hunting weekends, hosted dignitaries, and presided over glittering balls. For a brief flickering moment, she believed she could mend both the castle and her husband's shattered spirit. As she later confessed to a friend, "I knew I loved him. I knew I wanted to save Inverary. What he felt, I don't know." The discord between them soon became an open secret among aristocratic circles. At parties in London and receptions at Inverary, whispers followed the couple. Margaret, with her diamond tiaras and extravagant couture, smiled through gritted teeth as her husband drank to excess, insulted guests, and accused her, often publicly, of infidelity. But what began as bitter arguments turned into a ruthless campaign. Ian Campbell, ever manipulative, became consumed by paranoia. Convinced that Margaret was not only unfaithful but plotting against him, he orchestrated a sinister plan to undermine her standing, both legally and socially. He had her car bugged with listening devices and her phones tapped. A shocking act for the time. He even went so far as to forge letters, attempting to discredit not only Margaret but also his own children from a previous marriage, suggesting they were illegitimate, in a warped attempt to consolidate control over his estates and inheritance. Margaret, however, was not one to suffer in silence. She fought back with equal ferocity. She accused Ian of a litany of misdeeds: alcoholism, violent outbursts, financial mismanagement, and, most scandalously, an alleged affair with her own stepmother. This was the sort of accusation designed to devastate a man in the cloistered world of British aristocracy, where appearances and bloodlines were everything. The couple quickly became embroiled in lawsuits, not only against each other but against friends, former lovers, and business associates drawn into their vortex of hostility. By 1959, their marriage was a ruin, held together only by appearances and legalities. The once glittering Duchess and the brooding Duke now lived apart, their few interactions marked by venomous exchanges and legal threats. In a particularly chilling act of vindictiveness, Ian obtained a court injunction effectively barring Margaret from Inverary Castle. He sent locksmiths to her London flat to change the locks, preventing her from accessing her own possessions. The campaign of harassment reached its apex when, while Margaret was away in New York attending a social function, Ian broke into her Mayfair apartment. Under the pretense of retrieving his own belongings, he ransacked the flat and uncovered what would become the most damning evidence in one of Britain's most scandalous divorce trials. Hidden in a locked cupboard, Ian found a collection of private Polaroid photographs, something of a novelty in the 1950s, as Polaroids were one of the first technologies that allowed for immediate private development of images, bypassing the discretion of the local chemist. Among the images were explicit photographs of Margaret herself. In some, she appeared nude save for her signature 3-strand pearl necklace. In others, she was captured mid-act with an unidentified man, his face deliberately cropped out of each frame. The anonymous lover was known only as the Headless Man, a moniker that would become infamous in British tabloid history. Ian Campbell knew he had struck gold in a society where a woman's virtue was still weaponized against her, especially one who held a title. These images would be more than humiliating. They would be utterly ruinous. It was a scandal that would make headlines around the world, drag the secrets of Britain's ruling classes into the harsh light of public scrutiny, and destroy one of the nation's most glamorous social figures. The divorce of Ian Campbell, 11th Duke of Argyll, and his wife Margaret, Duchess of Argyll, would be remembered not for its legal complexity, but for its sordid revelations, salacious gossip, and unparalleled public shaming. In April 1963, after years of vicious fighting, accusations, and private vendettas, the Duke finally made his move. He filed for divorce in London's High Court, citing his wife's alleged serial adultery as grounds. What might have been a quiet legal separation between two bitter aristocrats instead erupted into a full-blown national spectacle. The press would dub it the divorce of the century. From the outset, it was clear that Ian Campbell intended not just to divorce his wife, but to obliterate her reputation entirely. His legal team came prepared with what would become one of the most infamous documents in British legal history. A list of 88 men whom Ian claimed had been Margaret's lovers. It was a roll call of the British establishment. There were government ministers, film stars, society playboys, aristocrats, and businessmen. Even, it was whispered, members of the royal family. The mere hint of such names scandalized a public still clinging to post-war notions of propriety and decorum. But even more damaging than the names was the nature of the evidence. Ian Campbell presented to the court the now notorious Polaroid photographs, grainy, intimate images showing Margaret, naked save for her trademark 3-strand pearl necklace, engaged in sexual acts with a man whose face was carefully excluded from the frame. The identity of this so-called headless man would become one of the most tantalizing mysteries in British tabloid history. As soon as news of the divorce proceedings broke, Fleet Street's reporters descended on the court like vultures. Every day, headlines screamed with lurid innuendo, "Dirty Duchess in court shocker." Who is the headless man? Most embarrassing divorce in English legal history. Margaret Campbell, once the darling of London society, found herself publicly pilloried. Where she had once graced the pages of Tatler and the Sketch, now her name was splashed across the scandal sheets, her most intimate secrets dissected for public consumption. The identity of the headless man became the obsession of the age. Every man of status or note who had ever been in Margaret's orbit was speculated upon. One of the most persistent rumours pointed to Duncan Sandys, a Conservative government minister and the son-in-law of Winston Churchill. The idea that a figure so close to the highest echelons of British power might be entangled in such sordid affairs rocked the establishment. The rumours became so intense that Sandys was forced to consider resignation. Though he denied any affair with the Duchess and was never formally named in court, the damage was done. Other names whispered included Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Prince Ali Khan, and even Max Aitken, 2nd Baron Beaverbrook, heir to one of Britain's most powerful newspaper empires. None would be conclusively identified. The mystery would remain unsolved, a riddle that the British tabloids gleefully revived for decades afterward. Inside the High Court, the tone was merciless. Margaret Campbell was forced to endure days of character assassination that, even by the standards of the day, bordered on the medieval. The Duke's legal team spared no detail in describing the explicit Polaroids. The pearls, the poses, the deliberately obscured face of her lover. Every sordid element was dissected in open court. The prosecution painted Margaret as a woman of depraved appetites, incapable of fidelity or decorum, indulging in disgusting sexual activities to gratify a debased sexual appetite. Margaret attempted to mount a counterattack. She accused Ian of infidelity, including the shocking claim that he had carried on a sordid affair with her own stepmother. It was a desperate move, and one that fell flat. The court and the press beyond it had no interest in Ian's misdeeds. In the 1960s Britain, the sins of men were sins, but the sins of a woman, particularly one of Margaret's stature, were an unforgivable scandal. For 3 relentless days, Judge Lord Wheatley presided over the case with icy detachment, before delivering one of the most excoriating judgments ever recorded in a British courtroom. In words that would reverberate through British society, he branded Margaret, a completely promiscuous woman whose sexual appetite could only be satisfied with a number of men and whose attitude to the sanctity of marriage was what moderns would call enlightened, but which, in plain language, was wholly immoral. His words, shocking even in 1963, effectively sentenced Margaret not just to a legal defeat, but to a public disgrace from which she would never fully recover. If the High Court passed its verdict, it was the court of public opinion that delivered the harshest sentence. Margaret Campbell had not merely lost her marriage, she had been publicly eviscerated, humiliated, and ostracized by the very society she had once ruled. The press gleefully christened her the Dirty Duchess, a moniker that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Friends abandoned her. Social invitations dried up. Former lovers and allies swiftly distanced themselves, terrified of being caught in the backdraft of scandal. For Margaret, it was a devastating reversal. From glittering balls at Claridge's and weekends at Inverarray Castle, she now found herself unwelcome in the salons and drawing rooms of polite society. In private, she remained defiant. In public, she wore her downfall like a tattered cloak, refusing to issue apologies or seek forgiveness. Margaret would later remark, "I have always been of the opinion that it's far better to be looked over than overlooked." But beneath the bravado, the damage was irreparable. The divorce of the Duke and Duchess of Argyll came at a peculiar moment in British history. The early 1960s marked the twilight of Britain's old social order. Within months of Margaret's trial, the Profumo affair would rock the government, exposing the hypocrisy of Britain's elite and accelerating the decline of the deferential post-war society. In many ways, Margaret was the last great aristocratic scandal of the old era. Where future sex scandals would become political crises or celebrity gossip, Margaret's downfall felt like the closing chapter of a society unable to reconcile private vice with public virtue. The British public, by turns titillated and scandalised, moved on. But for Margaret Campbell, the stain of the divorce would never fade. From the moment Ian Campbell served the divorce papers with those Polaroids, Margaret became fodder for a national witch hunt. Newspapers trampled her privacy. One editor sneered that it would be fortunately impossible for women to break her record of lovers. A contemporary columnist wrote that the so-called Duchess of Argyll has dominated high society, but now she faces the price of a gross breach of decorum. London society turned its back on her. In the wake of the trial, Margaret was effectively exiled from polite circles. Ladies' Club forbade her entry. And even after the divorce, her title became a byword for debauchery. In tabloid tracts, she was irrevocably the Dirty Duchess. Ironically, only Margaret's side of the story was aired. Details of the Duke's own affairs were never mentioned in court. He was never questioned for having broken into her home or stealing and publishing those intimate photos, actions that today would be called revenge porn. As one historian observes, details of the Duke's infidelities weren't mentioned during the proceedings. Nor was he censured for what we would now see as abhorrent behaviour. The entire blame fell on Margaret. According to Time magazine, through a modern lens, the highly sexed Duchess might be seen as sexually liberated, but in 1963 she was instead subjected to vicious slut-shaming. Even though British society was beginning to liberalise, the pill was coming, the old guard waning. Most still agreed with the judge's rebuke, seeing Margaret's choices as a scandalous betrayal of her rank and sex. Inverary Castle in Scotland, the ancestral seat of the Dukes of Argyll, became a gilded prison for Margaret. Despite centuries of grandeur, the castle's law is forever entwined with the Argyll divorce scandal. At Inverary, she had tried to play the dutiful wife by bankrolling the castle's upkeep. After the divorce, her daughters recounted that she feared being disinherited. Every last penny of her own fortune was suddenly at stake. Town and Country notes that following the trial, Margaret made several unsuccessful attempts to recuperate her reputation and once again monetize her social standing. In other words, she began to feel the full sting of poverty. The years after the trial found Margaret Campbell fighting a new battle, simply to survive. Stripped of her title in society's eyes and laden with legal judgments, she turned into a cautionary figure. A judge ordered her to pay most of Ian's court costs, about £50,000 at the time, well over £1 million today. The Duchess's lavish lifestyle was suddenly unsustainable. She launched libel suits against newspapers and old friends, but won nothing and lost more money. She penned memoirs and even a cookbook of party recipes, hoping to reclaim some public sympathy, but they sold poorly and drew harsh reviews. By the late 1970s, Margaret's fortune was nearly gone. Reports say she moved into a modest hotel in central London. Guests recalled a once regal woman who had inexplicably lost everything. Town and Country later reported, by the late 70s, her mounting debts forced her to move into a hotel. In 1990, she was evicted for failing to pay the bills. Even that was too much. In 1990, a caretaker from another top London hotel recounted telling her, "I'm sorry, Duchess, but you owe us too much money." She paid one final humiliation charge and left her grand name behind. In her last years, Margaret lived quietly, shuttered away from the press that once hounded her. Occasionally, she would surface, for example, as a guest on television, talk shows in the 1980s. On one 1988 episode of After Dark, an ace camera woman snapped the former Duchess seated between two men, still carrying herself with dignity despite the circumstances. Margaret Campbell, Duchess of Argyll, Centre, appears on a British TV talk show in 1988. Even decades after the trial, her presence could captivate viewers and stoke memory of the scandal. These were rare glimpses of the woman behind the headlines, and they only deepened the public's fascination with her fate. In July 1993, at age 80, Margaret Campbell died quietly in a nursing home outside London. She had scarcely a penny to her name. Newspapers noted the irony. The woman once hailed as one of Britain's great beauties died alone, almost penniless. Her obituary in the Times mentioned the 1963 divorce only obliquely. Long after the most famous divorce of the century, the Duchess of Argyll faded into near anonymity, a scandal-ridden symbol from a vanished era.